I'm going to go back to basically the financial crisis and Europe's response to the financial crisis, because 10 years ago, big stuff happened in Europe, and it really kind of shaped the European economy for the next decade. And just when we were kind of turning the corner on that, we got hit by COVID. And then just when it seems we're turning the corner on that, they're basically Russia is the spoiler that invades Ukraine and changes the game again. And between all that, the title, which I thought up long before the Ukraine war started, was you are stuck between these two sources of instability now. One is Russia, and the other one is China. I'll let you figure out from your own imagination which ones I was alluding to in the title. So with that, let's get going. 12 years ago, there was a crisis. And that crisis had to do with debt. And you see by 2012, you have a lot of debt in Europe, over 100% of debt to GDP in Ireland and Greece and Italy. And with COVID, those numbers have gotten even bigger. We have not reduced the debt in any way, but we had this big thing called the debt crisis. So how did that come about? And I want to tell you two stories, and they're both right, but you only ever really hear about one of them. And the second story is why we responded the way we did and why that was important for figuring out what happens next. So what's the first story? This is the graph you need to see. This is basically how much interest you have to pay to issue debt in the European Union from 1990 all the way to 2011. And what you see there in the middle of that is a great compression of these rates. If you go to the start, the big thick red line is Greece. Greece used to have to pay 25% interest to get someone to buy a bond. That's a heck of a lot of cash. But even the more sort of, how can one put it, less peripheral became the language sovereigns, like Belgium and Italy and even France, you're paying 15% interest back in the day, which is unheard of now. So why was this great convergence to 1999? Well, that's because when the euro came in. And when the euro came in, what happened was this thing called the ECB, European Central Bank. The European Central Bank basically prints the money. Countries no longer have printing presses. And what that means is the ability of countries to inflate their way out of trouble by running the printing presses is gone. And their ability to devalue to solve their economic problems is gone. So they have to run a very tight fiscal ship and make it a very much more orthodox kind of economic policies. In anticipation of this, markets price this in. And what you see is that kind of convergence in bond yields. And then in 2009, the crisis happens and boom, they all split apart again. So why did that happen? Well, story one focuses on what we call current account imbalance. It's basically the difference between exports and imports. The red line is Germany. Germany used to run a deficit. Then it became the only people running a surplus, with the possible exception of Ireland, and that's too small to really make a difference. Everybody else basically fell into deficit. So how do we explain this situation? And you know a lot about this because you hear about the Germans being super competitive and all this sort of stuff. So what was the story? Well, a lot of it was the fact that these governments, because the price of issuing this debt became so much cheaper, issued a lot of debt. And then they spent a lot of money, and that drove up wages and prices. And that annual growth in government expenditure meant there was more money around, so people imported more and exported less. And all of this was made possible in a way by that convergence, which we talk about as the transfer of Germany's credit rating to the whole of Europe. The ECB became, if you will, Deutsche Bank über alles. And inflation and devaluation risks in these bonds was taken off the table because of the application of strict fiscal rules governing debts and deficits and inflation rates. And that was the yield convergence, which led to the overborrowing, which led to too much money in the system, which led to, particularly in the South, excessive consumption. That massively eroded wage competitiveness because essentially your prices and wages are going up. You're importing, you're not exporting. As you can see here, Ireland, Spain, Italy, Greece, exactly the people that get into trouble. Basically, their unit labor costs are getting very, very high. It's very expensive. So their current account's getting completely out of whack. But the key thing is all of this was made possible by external debt increases, essentially borrowing from the north of Europe, the exporters, the so-called frugals we call them these days, and borrowing in the south. When the inevitable result was when the mortgage crisis hit in 2008 and bank lending dried up, all of those bond yields exploded. And why did they explode? What was the problem? Well, basically because when you've been issuing all this debt, you've got to be able to service it. And if the banks stop lending and the liquidity dries up and you can't service those bonds anymore, the yields spike and you can't pay that and people start to freak out. Now, that's a good story, but there's something missing in this story, and it's this one. And here's my favorite picture from the financial crisis. Citibank had an advertising campaign back in the day called Live Richly. It wasn't save up and buy yourself something nice. It was open a cravings account. And what does that tell us? It tells us that we need to run that story again, because you can't really have over borrowing without over lending. So what else is another interpretation of that chart? Imagine I'm a banker. I make 25% by showing up and buying Greek debt. They might default, but it's still a good gamble. I know that the ECB is going to come along and take all that off the table. So how do I make money on a declining spread of interest rates? I pump up the volume. It's called leverage. I just buy tons of that stuff. I like these bonds, even though there's the money I make off them is going down. If I buy enough with volume, I can continue to make a ton of cash. The result of this is that foreign banks, i.e. the ones that are buying these bonds, they're lending to and borrowing from these sovereign sovereigns, end up with, in the case of France and the Netherlands, over 30% of GDP in bonds that are about to go bad. So the result of this was what? Well, this is a really scary picture. This is European GDP in 2012 on the left. That's bank assets. Now, when banks talk about assets, they don't talk like normal people. When you think about an asset, you think about your home. You think about having something that is an asset to you. When banks talk about assets, they're talking about all the money that they've lent to people. So that right-hand column is all the money that they've lent that they might not get back relative to the size of the Eurozone's GDP. Now, the term too big to fail was coined in the United States. And if you look on the left, the right-hand side here, you see US GDP indexed at 100, and you see total bank assets in America. It's about 118. So it's bigger than the country. But let's take a typical example in Europe. There's France. There's GDP indexed to 100. There's total bank assets in 2012, 430. It's 4 times the footprint of the country. You don't have too big to fail. You have too big to bail. So if you want to stop a bank run around the bond markets of Europe as everyone freaks out and dump these bonds, what do you have to do? This is the word that was the buzzword of 2012 that I wrote a book about, called austerity. Cutting budgets to stabilize bond yields and increase investor confidence. If you have all those banks in your bank's balance sheet and you don't want them to go to zero and you don't want the banks to blow up, you have to get the countries to stop issuing extra debt to stabilize those yields so that they can move forward. Problem was, it didn't work. There was no confidence fairy, as Paul Krugman said, that showed up and made everyone feel super good about cutting budgets in the middle of a recession. What actually happened was that growth and real incomes fell throughout Europe, particularly in the South. Doubling down on this in 2012, the Union tightened up rather than loosened the budget rules, which made the recession even deeper. The South fell into actual deflation. Austerity wasn't loosened until 2015, and the recovery didn't kick in until 2017. But the problem was the combined effects of this, particularly northern dominance. Northern and Eastern European countries make their money off of exports, meant that you had a falling value for the euro and increasingly cheaper wages. All those wage increases were wiped out. That stimulated exports, which was good for those northern and eastern countries, but didn't really work for the large southern economies like Italy and France that are much more consumption-based. This leads to a split in the EU that we still have today between southern consumption-led economies and northern and export-led economies. And that's why you basically have chronic an overall surplus of the EU against the rest of the world through exports, selling BMWs to China, etc. And then you've actually got internal deficits in the budgets in the South because they can't grow their way out of the recession they've been in for the past decade. Now, here's a picture of EU growth since the crisis. As you can see, it's based at zero. Around 2015, it gets up to around 1%. 2018, it's sprinting towards 2%. But even before COVID, it really starts to slump again. Then there's the huge dump in COVID, and then a huge springing out, which seems to be a real turning of the corner here. Well, what happens? Well, they stop doing austerity for real and actually start spending money. The EU suspends the debt rules because of COVID, creates a $700 billion recovery fund. The Green New Deal actually becomes a real thing, and the ECB becomes much more green growth focused, all of which is pushing Europe on a much healthier growth trajectory. But how is that recovery feeling, right? Have a look at this. This is real growth in per capita GDP. And what you see is, like, look at Greece. The blue bar is the first period before the crisis, right? That's growing. That's a growing economy. In fact, everyone's growing before the crisis. Look at 2008 to 2018. Greece is negative, Italy is negative. That means that they're poorer now than when they started back in 2007. And everyone else has been crawling along, with the partial exceptions of Germany and Ireland. Happy to talk about why that is the case in the Q&A. Now, if that wasn't enough and COVID hitting you, in the meantime, the world had completely changed. And the speaker this morning spoke about this, the fact that many of the assumptions that the EU was based on, basically perpetual peace and trade and democracy being permanent fixtures, began to get seriously challenged. And I think what we can do now is talk about a new geopolitics after COVID that looks like this. And the first one is the disunited states of America. Trump was not an aberration. It's coming back, spoiler alert. Second, China's newfound socialism. Turns out the Communist Party of China was actually communist. The clue was in the name. Who knew? And the EU gets caught in the middle of all this. And the key idea I want to talk about domestically and internationally is the really big problem facing us, even before we get to having a major war in Europe, was the distributional politics of climate change. Now, why is that important? Let's start with the USA. Have a look at these two maps. If you look at the electoral map for Trump and then dump it on top of the states with the largest carbon signatures, it's a near perfect fit. So what's been going on? Back in 1971, 1 in 5 jobs in America was in auto and 1 in 3 was in related industries. The oil shocks of the 70s and the shift to services and finance, et cetera, in the 1980s and 90s concentrates carbon assets in specific states, i.e. Republican ones, not coastal ones. So if you think about political polarization, it's about many things, but it's also about, and you saw this very much with the struggle over Build Back Better and the failure of the Democrats to get it through their own people, is it's a political polarization is really a function of transition trust. That is to say, the red states have a carbon-based business model, they're doubling down on it, and they do not trust the blue states to effectively or practically bail them out. Given this, US commitment to decarbonization is in doubt over the long term, given this split. So if that's the case, what does that mean? It means that US domestic politics are destabilizing. There's Josh Hawley at the January the 6th riot. The Republican Party is de facto now a right-wing populist party. I disagree with the ambassador yesterday saying that most populism has passed. We weathered the storm. We haven't even seen it really begin. What's going to happen next is that the GOP is going to basically win in 22, possibly in 24. These folks are climate change denialists, not because they don't understand the science, because it's the business model of the core states of their supporters. So Biden will lose the ability to pass legislation in 22. The GOP returns to power in 24. And you can effectively bet that there will be a bonfire of ESG and climate change regulations, and the country will go on a 10-year carbon binge. The problem with this is already destabilizing globally because of the pivot away from Europe, which was begun by Obama and has become consolidated and bipartisan in the current moment. The US pull out of Afghanistan belies an enormous defense increase over the next 10 years based on the Navy, which is squarely focused on China. The US will defend Taiwan if China invades, particularly now given current events. It cannot afford to look weak. And the US under the GOP in its post-carbon moment will effectively give up on NATO. Perhaps Ukraine changes this, and focus on a Pacific isolation strategy with regional players and bilateral arrangements. China has turned inwards. The guy in the background is the guy who is basically the thinker behind all the stuff that you're seeing just now, specifically the common prosperity agenda. The party's turned against other elites, financial, tech, entertainment, and seeks to reduce inequality. Basically, what China did was have a think to itself and said, all right, so the America has generated a whole bunch of billionaires. Half the country works for less than $20 an hour. The American dream is unattainable for most people. They're ripping each other's faces off politically. What did we get out of this? Oh yeah, a couple of guys with spaceships. Let's not go that way. So the party's turning away from property-led growth and financialization and trying to find a new inward focus, much more equalizing business model. Now, the thing is, they're really ramping up green investment. Here's a tweet that I put out on February the 4th, a thought for the weekend. Last year, China built more offshore wind capacity than the entire world had installed in the previous 5 years. The previous leader was the UK with 10 gigawatts. China built 1.5x that last year alone. How's your transition going? They are very serious about this stuff. Now, why? because China's climate politics are globally significant. They're heavily dependent on coal, but Xi has just banned Belt and Road coal investment. 2060 is a net zero target. They actually want to get to 2050. They banned Bitcoin while pushing a digital renminbi, not just for the environmental footprint, but that was a nice excuse for doing so. As I've said, they've massively ramped up green tech and basic investment, and they want to dominate the EV market. That's a declared strategic goal of the state. So here's the kicker. If I look at these maps on the side, what are we showing you here? This is the projections for a 3 degrees Celsius increase in surface temperature affecting China. Basically, around 2/3 of its major eastern seaboard becomes uninhabitable for several months a year. It reaches wet bulb temperatures where the body can't cool itself. They have a huge problem, and they have every incentive to actually fix it. Now, why is that globally significant? Because it means that they will take climate change seriously exactly the moment that the United States is refusing to acknowledge its existence. The problem is, of course, that while that may be positive, its foreign policy is extremely destabilizing. The commitment to reunify Taiwan is deadly serious. Xi's credibility is now dependent on it. They'll have the capability by 2024, right in time for the US elections. And if you think that COVID was bad for global supply chains, wait until that one goes kinetic. Now, what's the EU been doing? It's a little unfair, this one, but I do like that cartoon. Honestly, I can't tell the difference. Red, blue, red, it's all the same to me. Why? What have they been doing? They've been playing hide and trade. Germany's the best example of this. Basically, German foreign policy for the past 20 years has been plane loads of executives from the engineering sector and export sector getting on a plane with Merkel and flying to China to do trade deals. Those deals are still ongoing, and you see this in the reticence as we speak. The last holdout for kicking Russia out of SWIFT is Germany. They have a very mercantilist orientation to the foreign policy. Now, the EU is rightly worried by the US stance on China and also by China itself. But EU exports, the bit that's been growing since the crisis, are crucially dependent on Chinese growth. Now, the EU, in its positive and engaging side, sees green tech as a way to cooperate and compete with China. The EU green transition is underway. The ECB and the UK central banks are risk-weighting brown assets. There's a lot of asset there. The structural funds are effectively becoming green transition funds. And what does this give us? There's a great book that just came out by Jonas Nam that talks about this, that basically says the following. It's going to push China and the EU together on green investments. I have a golden retriever here that I think is telling me I'm going to go pee on the floor unless you let me out soon. So I may have to run off for a second, but let's see how that goes. What does this give us? US policy in China pushes China and EU together on green investments. Why? Country with leading edge large export sectors can adapt to green tech easier. Here's an interesting fact. According to Jonas's research, 40% of the output of the Mittelstand, the German industrial sector, already goes into green tech. Right? It doesn't matter if they're making the ball bearings for a diesel engine or for a windmill. You want it to be in the one that's still going to have a market in 10 years, and that is not diesel engines. You also have enough organized labor that you can effectively do coalitions that internalize the cost of the transition, and that allows you to make the politics of the transition much easier. The US doesn't have any of that. It sent all its export capacity to China. It's good on innovation, but stops it getting the IPO, the exit, and cashing out and marrying a supermodel. The US risks becoming dependent on green tech made elsewhere, even if it avoids open conflict. But for the next 10 years, if the GOP are in charge, they won't even care if they get it. And if there is a conflict with China, this will split NATO and empower China over the long term. The wild card. You knew it had to be in here. Russia is a system spoiler. The EU is heavily dependent on Russian gas and oil. We know this. Russia is also a swing producer in wheat as well as in oil and gas. It's a critical source of rare earths, and US militaries are not EU militaries are not credible threats due to decades of underinvestment. So where does all this leave us? Where do we go from here? I think there are two scenarios going forward. The first one is Russian aggression encourages the EU to accelerate the green transition. That in fact, what we were going to do in 15 years, we'll be trying to do in 5 years as we decouple from gas and go as green as possible. Given this, and there's no reason why not, because the technological capacity is there, what is lacking is the political will, the EU becomes the global leader on green tech and adaptive technologies. To safeguard that, you're going to have to rebuild the EU military's capability and make that credible. And then the EU and the US rebuild the rules-based order based upon these actions. That is the good outcome. What is the bad outcome? EU dependence on Russia plus stagflation leads to backsliding, not on democracy, but on the green transition. The EU becomes dependent on Chinese green tech. The US abandons NATO and the EU fails to compensate militarily, thereby becoming incredible actors. Lots of talk about norms, but no ability to enforce them. And what we get to is exactly what Putin is after, the return of spheres of influence. We are in the middle of incredibly turbulent times. We have two massive problems. One is you've got a system spoiler that actually threatens with nuclear weapons and is dangerously unstable. At the same time, you have a green transition whereby the carbon budget is pretty much being exhausted. And if you don't get real soon, you're in the type of trouble that even Putin can't imagine. There has never been a more important time for Europe to come together. There has never been a more important time for Europe to act as one. If it does it at this moment in time, it's going to be crucially important because America is going to be out of the game for the next 10 years, in my estimations. What then matters is the relationship that we have with China, and then how we manage the green transition and how we effectively isolate Russia. And I will leave it at that point. There, lots of time left for Q&A. How's that? I can't hear you, David. You muted.
There we go. And so let's bring some of those questions in. camcon2022@gmail.com. Your questions have been great so far. Keep them coming. Tell us your name and tell us where you're writing from, if you don't mind. You can use first names if you like. Dr. Blyth, I mean, when Florida is half underwater and California is burning to the ground, are we still going to soft pedal our own green transition here in the US?
Well, that used to be my bellwether, David. I'd have to take some event like that, right? It's going to be Miami's half underwater. But think about it this way. Goldman Sachs is moving a huge amount of its operations from New York down to Florida for beaches and tax dodges. And although the footprint of a financial firm isn't sort of, something that can't be moved, we're not moving away from the vulnerable areas. We're moving into the vulnerable areas. Right? We are completely in denial about this because it's just inconvenient. Our entire civilization is built around the exploitation of fossil fuels. Getting off of that is really hard. Our politics are polarized precisely along this metric, and nobody has a good answer how to do it because the left doesn't trust the right and vice versa to manage a transition.
And I mean, to reinforce your point, right? I always wondered that maybe there would be this thing that would happen with climate change and the scales would fall off everybody's eyes and they would see it. Well, COVID happens and people might be living in a family where a close relative died of this disease, or they themselves might be dying, and the scales in some cases didn't even fall off the eyes of those people that are whatever we teach ourselves are our own values outweigh what our eyes see.
No, I think that's right. Tragically, that's the case. Jonas Nam, who I mentioned earlier, who did that work in green industrial policy in China and the EU, he has some data that looks into what we spent the COVID money on. So he's got basically all of it, all the programs throughout Europe. And what he figured out was something really surprising. Despite all the talking about how this is going to go into green tech and green financing and all this sort of stuff, a tiny fraction of it, around 9% of the total, went anywhere near the green transition. And of that 9%, 80% had nothing that had any impact directly on emissions reductions. So even in the place that is the most committed to it amongst the democracies, when we try and do it, we're still not even doing it.
Mm. But I was struck. Okay, so you have West Virginia, coal mining state, and I looked it up. There's about 14,000 coal mining jobs still in West Virginia. Neighboring Tennessee is going to get 3 new Ford plants, 3 or 4, to build batteries for electric vehicles and to build electric vehicles. And the hope there is that over some time, about 14,000 people will get hired. Mm-hmm. Now, I know that Tennessee's benefit is not going to cheer up anybody who's, dependent on fossil fuel for their paychecks in the neighboring state. But it might change minds in Tennessee, and so that could change the political calculus.
It could. I mean, the wind power in Texas is a really big deal, but it's still, oil. There's also the mythology of growth models, as we call them locally. I'll give you an example. As soon as we're in Maine, virtually. When you think of Maine and the Maine economy, what do you think? Individuals, lobsters, lobstermen, all that sort of stuff. More people work in insurance in Maine than work in lobstermen. But if you actually went after them and said, we should phase this out, it's really bad for the environment, it's destroying the oceans, it's screwing up right whales and all that sort of stuff, which people have made those claims. You try and go near them and you will face a hell of a political price. It's not the numbers that counts. Partly it's the symbolism of what these jobs are and what they mean to communities and the respect that they give people. You're phasing out people's livelihoods. That never goes well, particularly when you don't really have a fallback that anyone believes in.
Yeah, because the same people who might benefit from the green transition, and there may be, according to a McKinsey Global Institute analysis of this, that's fairly rigorous, there may be, in the end, more jobs created than are lost, but it's not the same person. And so the person who loses the job is going to stay mad. And I understand how that would play into your analysis. Now, connecting values and economics back to Europe, we have a question from a gentleman named John Reed from here in Camden. Has Russia, in essence, given up on economic integration with Europe in exchange for what will be a subordinate relationship with China? Does this imply that values are more important than economics to Mr. Putin?
I would say that's the case. I mean, you've got someone who is never going to leave power. He's set himself up to basically be in power until I think it's 85 or 86 or something like this. So what's the end game? Well, the end game is clearly challenging the post-Cold War order and trying to reestablish some degree of Russian hegemony over these areas. I had the pleasure of having Dr. Fiona Hill here at Brown yesterday to give a talk, and she spoke about it this way, and I thought it was a fantastic way of thinking about it. The West in general operates with a 20th century conception of governance that has to do with things like rights, not just personal rights, property rights. So you own stuff, you get to do things with it. In Putin's conception, it's a 19th century Russian feudal understanding of territory and property and rights. You are given these things as grants by the Tsar. You don't really own them. If you're Khodorkovsky and you go off and try and sell that that oil company to a bunch of foreigners, you're in jail. And his attitude towards Ukraine is the same. Essentially, no, you don't really own this territory. You're just whatever we decide. So it's a very different way of thinking about the entire project, if you will, of rule and governance. Now, it's massively out of step with everyone, including the Chinese. Does he want to become a kind of rump carbon producer at a time when everybody else is making the transition happen? His bet is that we're going to screw up the transition. His bet is that it's not going to happen. And right to the end, we're going to be drowning ourselves in oil and carbon. And he's going to be one of the primary producers and he's going to benefit from it.
A question from Ryan Young, Brewer, Maine, which is near Bangor. Do you think that China, in the end, will outcompete the EU in its decarbonization project?
Well, that tweet that I put out for a reason. I couldn't believe it. I mean, the one that I used to know was in 2015, China installed more solar than the US had. Apparently, they're just doing this every year. And as I say, they've got every reason to do so. If they don't do something to reduce global temperatures, then places like Shanghai and Beijing become effectively unlivable within a 3-degree window, and we're well on track for that. So in order to get there, will they end up leading? If the incentives point the right way, I guess. And if Europe basically doesn't step up to the plate and really commit to doing this and leave all this nonsense from the 1990s about budgetary rules and fiscal rigor and all this nonsense behind, they're simply not going to be able to finance the type of transition to compete with China.
So interesting. I mean, you've seen commentators on the right writing in Europe and also the Wall Street Journal that Germany's move away from the fossil fuel economy strengthened Putin's hand. Because
in the way that they did it, essentially by abandoning the 3 nuclear plants and then basically having a budgetary policy which has meant that net investment in Germany by the state has been flat for a decade. But that's mismanagement. That's not the transition, right? You can commit to that and do something different. They didn't do that.
Hannah Bilodeau of Auburn, Maine, is focused on your assumption that things do not go well for Democrats in 2024. If that's not the case, and Democrats win 2024, does something profound change on this?
Yeah,
on this whole
absolutely. It profoundly changes. I'm just incredibly pessimistic about the ability of the Democrats to do this for reasons, to do with the fact that like Biden managed to increase the vote share in very unusual ways. But then again, so did Trump. A lot depends on whether Trump comes back or not. But basically, as far as we can see, the effect of the pandemic has been further politicization, further polarization. And the Democrats basically have to kind of electorally work 15% harder than the Republicans to get people elected because of rule changes and gerrymandering. So the playing field isn't level, even in the democracy of the US itself. So yes, if they manage to pull it off, I will breathe a very large sigh of relief, not because I'm by nature a Democrat or something like that, but because the commitment to climate change will still be there. But even in that case, will they be able to lead? You have to remember, this is Jonas's argument, and I think it's very powerful. What the United States has done is essentially offshore its capacity to manufacture stuff. We saw this with the crisis with PPE and everything else. And they're not going to onshore all that stuff back. So it's a bit like, Germany is completely beholden to Russia because of gas imports. We're completely beholden to China because that's where we make all the stuff that we consume. So there's that kind of mutual dependence in there. Now, what that means is your ability to turn the economy around and manufacture huge amounts of green tech, particularly when most American firms are set up to basically be bought out by Google, and then the founders can retire marrying a supermodel. That's actually what happened with Instagram, right? It's actually what happened. I'm not being funny. When those are the incentives, there's just no follow through in the long term. And that's what I worry about.
The opposite of austerity is something that the EU has just during COVID, as you point out, begun to embrace, and you've seen recovery in some of the economies. A question from Charlotte of Mid-Coast Maine: should the EU do more to help stabilize the economies of Eastern Europe, Baltics, Poland, as Russia is doing what it's doing in the region? Is it time for more money headed to the Russian periphery?
Well, the interesting thing is some of the fastest growing economies have been the Eastern European economies. I mean, I think it's something that we do as Americans is to think about the EU and then Eastern Europe, but they are the EU, right? So in a sense, they've already benefited. And I'll give you an example of this. At the same time that Greece was effectively being shut out of financial markets and had to do the austerity budgets, etc., Poland managed to absorb 60 billion in European structural funds, which they use to upgrade their infrastructure, rebuild the roads, basically integrate themselves into German and global supply chains. They played an absolute blinder. If you go to Romania, right? Romania had some of the lowest wages in the EU 15 years ago. They've quintupled, 4 times rise, I think, in the minimum wage over the past 12 years, right? And that's the minimum wage. If you go to towns like CBU, they've become software centers for the auto industry. So Eastern European, in a sense, has been doing fine. What needs to be rebuilt isn't that form of spending money. It is quite simply defense expenditures. I mean, the Luftwaffe doesn't fly. German tanks don't roll. And there's no cross-party appetite to do so for lots of different reasons. But maybe the current moment changes that.
I mean, that does require a paradigm shift, but maybe this is the moment.
Well, I mean, if not now, when? I mean, what will it take? I mean, this is the European equivalent to Miami disappearing underwater, right? If the scales don't fall from the eyes and you don't start doing something different now, then really give up.
But a progressive thinker like yourself is okay with more militarization if it checks what's going on with the autocrat?
Yeah, because ultimately, if you don't do that, what's next? I mean, if he gets to do Ukraine, he will go to the Baltics. He's reinforced Kaliningrad, so he knows that we can't do resupply if they really come under threat. If he takes them next, what happens? And if he goes to the Polish border, the Poles will fight. So one way or another, this has to be halted because otherwise it can go exponential.
Mm-hmm. Ruth Griffith of Piscataquis Community Secondary School asked this question. You provided a counter-argument against the influence of populist forces, parties in Europe. How do you think populism will, she asks, impact economic integration within the EU? Does it slow it down?
So I wouldn't say I argued against it. I mean, I didn't really mention it. Here's how I fit populism into that story. When you basically don't spend any money through the public sector for 10 years, and as you saw in one of those slides to do with how's that transition feeling, right? If you're in Italy and your GDP level is where you were basically the end of the 1990s, if you're in Greece and you've effectively destroyed a third of the economy, even if they've been growing for the past couple of years, huge numbers of people have suffered quite plainly, and they lose faith in the political parties that say this is the only way, we have to all tighten our belts. And the problem with that is we're not all wearing the same pants, right? You've got massively different pants out there, and a little bit of belt tightening here is a lot of belt tightening somewhere else. And it's that asymmetry which gives populism the fuel. Right? If you just say it doesn't matter, the Greek example is perfect. 61 electoral district, every single one of them said no to the referendum in a democratic vote. What did we end up doing? Rationing cash to the Greek bank system until they capitulated. Right? That's the reality of basically, centrist governance. People will say, no, I don't want this anymore. So I don't think that this is over. I think it's a problem to be managed. But a large part of where populism came from was from like the moves that we ourselves made economically.
Hey, in your slides, you had Germany and Ireland as outliers with their own dynamic. What was up with Ireland?
So Germany, 80% of Europe's surplus against the rest of the world comes out of Germany. It doesn't mean that they produce 80% of surplus. It's produced in Romania, it's produced in Hungary, in the car plants or in the assemblies. And then the final value added where you make most of your money, a large part of that comes back to Germany because it's German firms, Siemens, BMW, et cetera, right? Ireland is essentially 3 million people that operate a tax dodge off the coast of Europe that gives large American multinationals access to the EU. So you don't really have to stick that much money in there to make a huge difference. They call it leprechaun economics. For a while at the end of the 2014-15 period, the American firms were doing inversions. They were basically making themselves tax domiciled in Ireland. They became Irish companies. Doing so overnight boosted their GNP by a factor of 2. It didn't mean that everybody in Ireland woke up the next day twice as rich. So it's a bit of leprechaun economics in that one.
All right, so I see what they're up to. Now, we didn't talk about Brexit. You've thought a lot about it. You're also particularly focused on the place you were born, about what's Scotland's role in a UK that is no longer at the center of Europe. Do you think Scotland and Wales might go a different direction from the UK?
Well, I not only do I think that they might, I don't know about the Welsh, but I can certainly talk about Scotland. I actually think that they should, and I didn't used to be on that side of the debate. And the reason I think about this is if you actually look about in the UK where wealth is generated, by far most of it is generated in London. And we can not talk about oligarchs or whatever, just talk about sort of, the industries like finance, et cetera, and high-end services, et cetera. It's all there. And to a large extent, large parts of the rest of the country lives off of transfers. Now, Scotland hasn't voted for a Conservative government, I think, since the 1950s, but they keep getting one. And if it's the case that because they keep voting Labour or SNP while everybody else is voting Conservative.
But the UK government keeps coming up Conservative.
You never get the government you vote for, right? Now, Scotland's a very small place, about 5 million people. 80% of them live between two cities that are well connected, Glasgow and Edinburgh. You've got great universities, a small tech hub, a carbon hub. There's no reason why if this was independent, it couldn't work. It's just a question of how you get there. Because the problem is, it's just like Brexit, right? Ultimately, what you would be doing is raising trade barriers to get away from a free trade zone. In the short term, that's costly. In the long term, it can open up possibilities. So, that's kind of where it is vis-a-vis Scotland. And in a way, even though I support it, they're facing the same dilemma as Brexit. Once you break off from this bigger free trade zone, you're going to raise your costs. How are you going to deal with that? That's the $64,000 question. And the Scottish government's got a new 10-year plan that they've just put out, which I was involved with, which tries to answer some of those questions.
Mark, you mentioned your austerity book. You didn't mention Angrynomics. And people should understand that there's a whole other way to think about U.S. politics.
Well, part of it is, the carbon stuff that I've been talking about, but, a large part of it, and actually Fiona Hill's book, which is a brilliant autobiography, plus kind of reflection on American politics called There's Nothing for You Here, really nails this one down. So why are people angry? Well, they're angry because of a loss of opportunity. They're angry because essentially inequality isn't uniform. It's, New York can be unequal, but New York's pretty rich on unequal. If you go to the Midwest, the United States, particularly those states where the three counties that flipped for Trump and made the difference in 2016, they used to be very, very high income areas. They no longer are. You've had the deaths of despair. You've had unemployment. You've had deindustrialization. And this is all stuff that Fiona and I saw in the United Kingdom in the 1980s, that she saw again in Russia in the 1990s, coming home to the United States in the 2000s. And that loss of a sense of self, a sense of purpose and control, the possibility of upward improvement, and a sense of being abandoned by your elites and belittled by them, yeah, that makes people angry. And that's a large part of what drives politics across the world now.
Riley May Emmert, who's a high school student, it looks like, in Lewiston, asks about the climate crisis. Dr. Blyth, she views it as inherently a public health issue, and we've been talking about it as an economic issue. And like the COVID pandemic has had devastating economic effects, why do you think that a more serious approach has to be taken to address the pandemic than to address climate change? In other words, we did get serious as best we could about COVID. It was imperfect, but there's, you're arguing what we're going to soft pedal it when it comes to the other big problem.
So a large part of it is, and this also goes to COVID, right? To most people, COVID was invisible. The reason you get resistance is because, you have to stay indoors and you have to do this and all the rest of it. Well, I mean, if you look at the death statistics, they tell an interesting story. Practically everyone who died was 10 years older than me, right? And comorbidities matter, and young people tend not to get it, particularly those under 10. These are all not controversial facts now. They're just true. I'm not a vaccine denier. Trust me, I'm triple vax, right? But what that means is people don't see people dying of COVID very often. They read about it. Certain families have been tragically touched by it. But the actual death rate across the United States, 900,000 people out of a population of 333 million over a 2-year period, actually isn't that high that it would become the thing everyone sees. And in this way, you get contestation. And climate crisis is very similar. You don't get to see it. I'm looking out the window today. We had a big snow dump yesterday, and today it's a beautiful blue sky. I know what's going on. I can visualize methane exposures. I can look at what's coming out of Siberia because of warming. I can think about the public health risks of viruses emerging from the permafrost. There's all these things, but we don't get to see them. They're not part of our everyday touch it, feel it existence. And in that way, they can become politicized by people who don't want their interests damaged. And I think that's, a large part of what explains both of those things. The fact that, we have this disproportionate concern by certain people like me, but if you walk out and go down the road, everything seems fine. And that disconnect is very difficult to mobilize around in politics.
Now, I know you have a dog with a full bladder, so I'm mindful of
I think she was actually just winding me up. She was totally fine. She just came upstairs to say, you've been on the screen too long. But he was making the noise, which is the kind of like, I'm going to go now. We need to go. But I think we're actually fine.
Okay, just check it because I'm mindful of your time. Keith of Lewiston is stuck in an interesting way on the call for European building up its military might. He writes, building up military capabilities seems the antithesis of going green. Is it a case of damned if you don't, he asks, or is there a way that that buildup could somehow reinforce the movement toward a more sustainable economy?
But right, the carbon footprint of the U.S. military is enormous, right? And and that's a huge issue. Unfortunately, we have this thing called the wild card, and he's intent on doing very bad things, so you kind of need it. If there is a positive side of this, to the extent that the United States innovates, it innovates out of the defense sector. And I'll give everybody a good example of this. You got one of these in your pocket, right? It's a smartphone. Okay. So what made this possible was Steve Jobs' genius. What was his genius? Because he didn't invent any of the tech in it. It was putting it all together in a box that we all wanted to work with and building apps that could utilize them. But the basic technologies here, TCP/IP, the Internet Protocol, was made by DARPA, Defense Advanced Research Projects. The touchscreen was Lodestar. That was the US Air Force. GPS, global positioning satellites, that was the US Navy, right? So to the extent that Europe is able to turn its military tech into civilian tech, then that could have, particularly in the AI area, for optimized control grids and better electricity grids, et cetera, more secure supplies, cryptography for making sure you're secure for cyber hacking, then those things could have a positive spillover. But the questioner is absolutely correct. At the end of the day, there is a certain damned if you do, damned if you don't. If we were all just nicer to each other, we wouldn't need to do all this stuff. But we seem to be incapable of that as a species.
These are all expensive things. You could say that cost-benefit analysis still works out that we must do these things. Certainly on the green revolution, you would argue also on beefing up Western Europe's military capacity. It's getting more expensive since the last time you and I talked to borrow. When you and I talked about a summer ago, interest rates were at zero or below. They paid you to take the money. It's different now, and inflation means that the costs of some of this stuff is getting much more expensive. Does that change the equation for you?
It certainly complicates it, because if you start spending even more money and making shortages of critical items, it's going to end up pushing more supply chain inflation. But I think that we have to look at it the following way. If you don't do this, you die. It's that simple. So it's not a cost benefit analysis. It's basically, you cannot sustain where you are. You need to adapt. The price of adaptation may be hideously expensive, but the cost of not doing it is actually worse. So to a certain extent, it doesn't matter. It's a public management question. It's a debt management issue. We often make the analogy to these situations of it's like a war. You heard this with COVID. COVID's like a war. We need to do things. Well, what do you do in wartime? You don't give a proverbial rat's patootie about what the debt level is. You just manage it in such a way that you don't blow up the economy with inflation, and then you work it out over the next 30 years by a variety of strategies. We've done this before. It's how we fought World War II. At the end of World War II, the United States, 164% debt to GDP. It was still the most powerful country in the world. So let's not sweat the debt. As I like to put it this way, nobody's ever died of debt, but they have died of stupidity.
Yeah. Well, again, with that McKinsey survey of what would be needed to get to net zero by the 2050, it looked like an enormous amount of money on the page. It was like $9 trillion a year from all the countries in the world for infrastructure, but we're already spending about $5 trillion, so it's not like 100 times more. It is more, but you're concerned that in the U.S. that ain't happening.
Even that ain't happening. I mean, you know, we can't build back, let alone build back better.
Yeah. All right, Mark Blyth, you've been very generous with your time. We'll see more of you, I hope, and I really do appreciate your insights on taking your political economist prism to take a view on all of this. Thanks so much for your time.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you.